Good afternoon and welcome along to Unbelievable with me, Justin Briley, your host for the next hour and a half here on the show that aims to get you thinking. It is the show that aims to bring together Christians and non-Christians on a regular basis. And don't forget, you can find us online where there are lots of past shows and features and resources and more besides. That's at premier.org.uk/unbelievable. And I'm excited to welcome on by phone today a guest I've long wanted to have join me, Peter Kreeft. We'll be finding out more about Peter and indeed our atheist contributor today, Richard Norman, in a moment's time. Don't forget, of course, that you'll be hearing some of your feedback towards the end of today's show as we look at some of your thoughts on the back of various shows that we've had in the past few weeks. Lots of interesting responses to those. So stay tuned right through to the end of the show to hear what you've been saying on Twitter, on Facebook and via email in regards to recent show topics. And of course, that is a good way to get in touch via email. So if you hear anything that you'd like to respond to on today's show, then do get in touch that way. Unbelievable@premier.org.uk. And I'll give out the ways to get in touch via the Facebook account and Twitter account in a little moment's time. Let's meet our guests on today's show.
You're unbelievable.
Well, today on the programme, I'm joined, as I mentioned, by Peter Kreeft, who's Professor of Philosophy at Boston College, well known as a Christian thinker and writer. His books include the Handbook of Christian Apologetics and Christianity for Modern Pagans. And we're going to be talking today with Peter about the argument from desire, asking, does our desire for God show that he exists? Well, in conversation with Peter on this subject today is Richard Norman, who's our atheist guest. He's Emeritus Professor of Moral Philosophy at the University of Kent, and his books include On Humanism. He's one of many Vice Presidents of the British Humanist Association as well. So a very warm welcome to you both, gentlemen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Peter, thank you very much for joining me on the show, and starting with you, I've had many people over the years say you really ought to get Peter Kreeft on, and expressing all kinds of admiration for you. And we finally managed to arrange a date for you to join us on the show, so I'm really pleased about that. For those who aren't so familiar with who you are, though, would you like to give us a potted summary of how things started for you in Christian faith and how you came, in the end, to be a professor of philosophy?
Well, the first question is hard to answer. That's like the question, where does a blade of grass begin? It begins in the underground, I suppose, in one's childhood experiences of one's parents and their trustability and honesty, and one naturally imbibes their values. Even Freud tended to admit that belief in God was innate, although he thought it an innate illusion. But I've never had a very serious crisis of faith in which I was an atheist for a little while, although I've had very brilliant atheist friends whom I was deeply sympathetic with. Philosophy is another thing that just grows in you. I was an English major in college and started to argue with all the writers, and I thought I'd better become a philosopher instead. I love arguing and I love debating, and I'm very privileged to be on this show because I love this sort of thing.
Well, it's great to have you on the show at last. Some people may not be aware also that you're a Catholic by background, though not growing up. In fact, you consciously converted from Protestantism to Catholicism, didn't you?
Yes, I was brought up in a kind of evangelical Calvinist environment, which I respect and admire very much, and read my way into the church thinking it was a temptation and concluding that it was historically accurate.
There you go. Another story for another day, perhaps, because today we want to focus on this fundamental issue that we're asking today. Does our desire for God show that he exists? And I think partially your interest in this particular argument stems from your love of C.S. Lewis. Would that be correct?
That is absolutely correct. Lewis has a place in the back of my mind. He keeps popping up all the time.
We'll come back to you in a moment, Peter, as we get the bones of what this argument from desire is all about. Let's meet our other guest for the moment, Richard Norman, our atheist guest today. As I mentioned, you're a retired professor of moral philosophy, emeritus professor. That's the way
what emeritus means. That's right.
It's a posh academic
way of saying retired. That's right.
So thank you for joining me today in the studio, Richard.
Pleasure.
Good to have you here. Have you always sort of more or less described yourself as an atheist? Did you ever have a period of belief?
I had quite a long period of belief, yes. I suppose, like Peter, I imbibed it for the first 20 years, really, because of the family context. I grew up as a Christian. First 10 years as a Baptist, that's to say I went to Baptist Sunday school and church, largely because my grandmother was a very committed Baptist. And then for the next 10 years, a Methodist, and I went regularly to Methodist church with my great aunts, sometimes twice a week. So very committed, but always trying to think it through as well. And I guess the decisive change in my beliefs came when I went to university, as so often happens, met new people from a very different background, and really came to the conclusion that the reason I had accepted Christian beliefs was ultimately because I'd been brought up with them, rather than because I could make a rational case for them. And that search for rational cases and whether one can make them very much led me into philosophy. So at the end of my first year at university, I switched to philosophy and never looked back.
And so that's what you've dedicated your life to doing, moral philosophy especially. As an atheist, though, do you find the questions around the existence of God interesting? Are they something you've looked at and been happy to leave aside for some time?
Undoubtedly interesting, yes. I mean, increasingly since I retired, I've been involved with the British Humanist Association, and I do a lot of debates and talks to religious groups, to Christian groups, and indeed often debate with Muslim speakers as well. And any atheist owes it to him or herself to come up with some account of why the vast majority of human beings throughout human history have believed in some kind of religion and some kind of God. So I don't think you can just dismiss it and say, oh, it's all nonsense. It's a perennial question in my mind.
It's interesting to hear you say
why the people believe this and I don't.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say that, because I do hear some atheists saying, I'm under no obligation to give a reason why I don't believe in God. It's rather Christians or believers who are under the obligation to show why there is a God.
Well, that's a slightly different point. I mean, logically, there's the question of where the onus lies and coming up with reasons. And actually, I do take the position that it's for the believer in a deity to come up with reasons for why such a deity exists, rather than for me to try to prove that that's not the case. But that's rather different from what I was saying about the need to try to understand why people believe what they do and why people differ so fundamentally over such a radical question that makes such a huge difference to people's lives.
Yeah. Well, let's get into this. And as I mentioned, if you're listening and you'd like to interact on anything you hear today, then you're more than welcome to send me an email. That's unbelievable@premier.org.uk, and we'll hear some of your feedback towards the end of today's show. You can also get in touch via Twitter. Follow me @unbelievablejb is my handle. Very happy to correspond that way, or indeed via the Facebook page. That's facebook.com/unbelievablejb, where I often post up new content, interesting articles that come my way during the week. So those are other ways to interact with the show. All those links and more available from the website, premier.org.uk/unbelievable.
Unbelievable with Justin Brierley.
Right, well, let's come back to you, Peter. I don't know if you wanted to add anything before we get into this argument from Desire.
I just wanted to add that I agree with two important points that our friend makes. One, that the onus of proof is indeed on the believer. The Bible itself says, be ready to give a reason for the hope that is in you. And secondly, I'm glad that he's a humanist and not just an atheist, because an atheist is just a negative term and a humanist is a positive term. And the fact that we probably share a good deal of moral values and concern for them unites us on a deep level, even though we differ about the ultimate explanation for that, whether it's God or not.
Okay, well, thanks for clarifying that. I mean, just if I might pursue this a little further, do you feel at any level, Peter, that an atheist is obliged to give reasons for their worldview at any level, that there is no God, that the universe has no ultimate purpose, and so on? Does any of that require evidence in the way a Christian might be required to give positive evidence?
Well, I think we have to distinguish whether we're asking the question logically or psychologically. Psychologically, both sides ought to give reasons for their beliefs, just to gain the sympathy of the audience. I mean, sympathy to say, I have no obligation to give any reason whatsoever for what I believe is a bad way of starting. But logically, I think someone who believes in something that is not either immediately logically self-evident or empirically present, and therefore undeniable, is under an obligation to give a reason. And God is, of course, not empirical and not immediately in our experience. So I think we do have to have a reason.
Well, you've sort of spent a lifetime giving those reasons, Peter. And we're focusing today on one argument which I don't think comes up very often in these conversations and questions, but one that you believe is a compelling argument yourself, though it doesn't, if you like, have all the normal aspects of what one might call a logical, deductive argument for the existence of God exactly. But I'll let you frame this argument from desire. Do you want to spell out what it essentially entails?
Yes. First of all, an argument is not necessarily a mathematical demonstration. An argument can leave wiggle room for the opponent to say, well, it's a valid argument, but there seems to be something wrong with it. In other words, I'm not claiming that one can prove the existence of God in the same sense that one can prove that E equals mc squared. The argument begins with an experience, a piece of immediate data that some people will say, I've never had, I just don't have. But most people have had this experience. It's a desire for something that you can't specify. I'm not saying it's a desire for God, because that presupposes that we already have a concept of God, a rich concept of God that comes from religious belief, a God that intervenes in history, a God that loves you, a God with a certain number of attributes, the full Monty, so to speak. I'm not claiming that the argument proves that thick slice of God, but I think it does prove a thin slice of God. It proves as much as the experience will give us. And that's also true of the more traditional cosmological arguments. The first cause argument doesn't prove that it's the God of the Bible who's the first cause of the universe, but that there's just some transcendent being in addition to the universe that's required to cause it. Well, something similar works with the argument from desire. And the experience is that if we consult our own hearts in honesty and in depth, we find that beneath all the many more obvious desires that we have, we find one that we can't quite define the object of. You might just call it perfection. The desire that, number one, there really be an objective reality, and number two, that you have the hope of somehow meeting or finding or seeing or attaining union with some object that's absolutely perfect, that's totally good, totally beautiful, totally true, totally moral, totally just, totally loving. And the name that we usually give for that is God, but we're not starting with the concept of God. We're getting a thin concept of God out of the argument. I think the most interesting thing about the argument is the experience itself, this mysterious longing for a better world, for a more beautiful something or other that we find not when we're miserable, but when we're the happiest, when we see something incredibly beautiful. A sunset, a baby, a woman's face, a great work of art, a piece of music. It seems to be a pointing finger, pointing beyond itself. It seems to be the smell of a delicious dinner that we haven't quite eaten yet. So our subconscious mind or spirit or heart is led to follow that pointing finger. And then the mind interprets that and says, well, what we're really desiring is something we've never yet experienced, something that's suggested, although certainly not proved, by these smaller beauties and good things that we can attain. It's an argument that's not the kind that philosophers usually like. It's not a clear and distinct idea. It's a something or other. Let's just call it an X. If you have that experience, and most people do, then the next step is, what does that mean? And we can interpret that experience by a general principle, a law, that seems to apply to every single desire that we have. We can classify our desires into natural and artificial. Artificial desires are stimulated by some particular detail of our environment that doesn't need to be there. Advertising, for instance, or exposure to a work of fiction, or somebody else's suggestion. The fact that you imagine Superman flying through the air and you desire to fly through the air doesn't mean that you will ever be Superman or that there is a Superman. But there are other desires that are natural. They're universal, they're innate, everybody has them, they come from human nature. The desire for food, for drink, for rest, for sex, for beauty, for justice, for friendship, and all those things exist. Every desire that stems from human nature itself corresponds to a really existing object that can satisfy that desire. You might not get it, you might starve, but hunger proves the existence of food. So put those two principles together, the experience and the general rule about desires corresponding to real objects, and the conclusion seems to be that there is somehow, somewhere, under some conditions, this mysterious X that transcends everything we can attain and indeed everything that we can properly conceive. And the name most people give to that is God. And I think that's common to pretty much all the religions of the world, even religions like Buddhism that say there is no God, because nirvana has many of the same attributes as God, even though it's not a person.
Well, it's a fascinating argument, and thank you for sharing it in a brief way that way. This idea that somehow this sense of the transcendent that people appear to have points, as you say, beyond itself, and in the way that one would see that other desires that we have, natural desires, do have some kind of an answer to them. Can this one also be seen as having an answer? Is it evidence for the existence of God? Just your first thoughts, really, Richard, in response to that line of thought.
Well, I think my very first thought is the thought that's summed up in your way of putting the initial question: does our desire for God show that he exists? And when put like that, it obviously sounds incredibly implausible. It sounds just like a non-starter. Wanting God to exist doesn't prove that there is a God. So clearly we need more than that, and we need something a good deal more robust than that, because otherwise it just looks like a classic example of wish fulfillment. To be honest, I think in the end it's a classic example of wish fulfillment, but obviously we need to look at the ways in which it can be set out more convincingly. So if I could just respond to the ways in which Peter has set it out, two starting points, two premises, if you like, although he didn't set them out as formal premises. But first of all, the claim about a certain kind of experience. And I'm really not sure what to say about that, because Peter began by saying it's a desire for something that one can't specify, something one can't quite define. And obviously, if he'd left it like that, the conversation couldn't have got much further. So he then went on to quite properly specify it and try to define it, and it seemed to be something like a desire for perfection. And the way in which I understood this is as an extension, if you like, of recognizable human desires for goodness and beauty and justice. And if we desire those things, then it seems natural to suppose that that people do desire those things to as great an extent as possible. But put like that, that's not going to take us very far, I think. So I think, first of all, then, there's a kind of ambiguity in that first claim as to whether it's a claim about desires which really are fairly universal, go pretty deep in human experience, but are recognizable as such without any need to point to anything beyond our worldly experience and the things of this world. On the other hand, if it's to do the work, it's got to be rather more than that. And I think that ambiguity then comes out if we look at Peter's second claim, that any natural desire rather than artificial desire must necessarily have some object, some real object, which is the object of that desire. Now, I'm not entirely comfortable with that distinction between natural and artificial desires, but let's go with that for the moment, though we might want to come back to that. But the examples that Peter gives of natural desires, which do have a natural object, and it'd be difficult to see how such desires could exist unless there were such an object. Clearly, first of all, those desires which are based in basic human needs for food and drink, and it's pretty easy to see why those must have an object. Clearly, just at a biological level, human beings wouldn't have evolved with those desires unless those desires could be satisfied. Less straightforward are desires for things like friendship and beauty and justice. And I think I'd be happy to describe those as as natural desires. And I think we can give some kind of account of why they're natural desires, though we might want to come back to that. But if that's what we're talking about, then yes, indeed, our desire for things like friendship and beauty and justice only exists, or at any rate only persists, because we have some idea in our experience of what it is to satisfy those desires. But that combination of those two claims really isn't going to get us very far, because if the kind of desire we're talking about just is the extended versions of those desires for things like beauty and goodness and justice, well, okay, we have those desires and they necessarily have an object, but that doesn't, as I see it, take us any real direction towards showing that there is even a thin slice of God.
Okay. Peter, any response on that?
Well, I think it does show a thin slice of God, because consider the alternative. If you admit that all other natural desires do correspond to really existing objects, and you deny that this desire for this mysterious X, this transcendent something or other, does not correspond to a really existing object, then consider what kind of a universe we're living in. It's a universe in which every single other desire corresponds to an object, but not this one. Okay, then that's like you walk into a fancy French restaurant and you're very hungry, and you want some soup and they give you soup, and you want some nuts and they give you nuts, and you want some wine and they give you wine. And now after all these appetizers, you expect that the main course is coming. And you don't really know what the main course is, but you're more hungry for that than anything else. And then when the main course comes, it turns out to be totally empty. Well, that's a plan. That's not randomness. That's a universe invented by a very clever and wicked being who wants to snooker us into playing a game that we're inevitably destined to lose. So most atheists think that since there's no God, the universe and human life within it is governed by random chance. I think at least this argument shows that is not the case. It's either God or the devil, because somebody is arranging all these appetizers, and if there's no main course, then they're all deliberately deceptive.
That's a very interesting way of putting it. What's your response to that?
I like the analogy. Yes, yes. Can I come back, Peter, if I may, on what I said was the ambiguity that I found in your presentation of this argument, and really it's the ambiguity in what the nature of these desires is that you're talking about. As I said, if one's talking about a desire for things like beauty or justice or goodness, then of course there are real things that correspond to those desires as the object of those desires. Now, what I'm not clear about is whether the so-called transcendent desires are, as it were, extended versions of those desires, just taking them further, in which case we don't have to claim that there must be perfect goodness, perfect justice, perfect beauty.
Yes, we do, because we desire not just quality but quantity.
Yes.
We find in ourselves a lover's quarrel with the world. You don't have to add another thing that we desire that's not friendship, justice, beauty, love, etc. You just have to add perfection in each one of them.
But why does that need any further explanation? Let's agree there is a natural human desire for beauty. Now, if there is, and we can explain why there is such a desire from our experience of beauty. I mean, it's not something easy to explain, but let's accept that it's a fundamental feature of human nature that that human beings are moved by beauty in nature, beauty in art, beauty in their fellow human beings. Now, isn't it perfectly natural to then recognise that if people desire this, then they should desire as much of it as possible. But that doesn't need any further explanation as to why people should desire perfect beauty. The explanation is just built into the nature of the desire for beauty.
It doesn't absolutely need any other explanation, but of the two explanations, God and no God, which one is the better one? Which more confirms and validates our desire for these things that we can identify?
Well, I guess that takes... Sorry, can I just interrupt? I mean, I guess that takes us back to our earlier conversation about where the onus lies. I mean, it seems to me that the naturalistic explanation has what's going for it, the fact that it doesn't require us to make any bold metaphysical claims at all. The naturalistic explanation is just very straightforward. Bringing God as the explanation is, it seems to me, a massive leap, which requires a lot more to validate it.
Let me invite you, Peter, to come back on that point in a moment's time. We're already at the end of our first section here. It does fly by. Okay. And we'll hear Peter Kreeft's response to Richard Norman, our atheist guest on the programme today. We're talking about the argument from desire, asking, does our desire for God or the transcendent show that there is an answer? There is something that will satisfy that desire in as much as God exists. Peter Kreeft is Professor of Philosophy at Boston College, my Christian guest on the show today, talking and defending this argument from desire. Richard Norman, our atheist guest today, and we'll be back in a couple of moments' time. You're listening to Unbelievable with me, Justin Brierley.
You're listening to Unbelievable on Premier Christian Radio.
Welcome back to Unbelievable with me, Justin Brierley. This is the show that aims to get you thinking on a Saturday afternoon, and of course we're available online at premier.org.uk/unbelievable. Very often we do cover issues around the existence of God on this programme, and I'm joined today by a Christian philosopher, Peter Kreeft, who is at Boston College, well known as a Christian thinker and writer. He's published many, many books. peterkreeft.com if you want to find out more about him. Richard Norman, my atheist guest today, he's Emeritus Professor of Moral Philosophy at the University of Kent and also one of the Vice Presidents of the British Humanist Association. Well, we're talking about the argument from desire. C.S. Lewis summed up the argument in this way. He said, creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for these desires exists. A baby feels hunger. Well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there is such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire. Well, there is such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. That's from Mere Christianity, of course, and as you mentioned earlier on, Peter, C.S. Lewis and the way he framed this argument, in fact, I think in the way it really had a hand in his own conversion, has been quite influential in the way you've thought about it as well. Now, just in that last section, Richard was questioning whether we really need God as an explanation. Aren't we just putting in a sort of extra level of metaphysical complexity at some level to account for these desires, whether or not we think they sort of have some transcendent sort of aspect to them? So what were you going to say in response to that?
Well, the crucial question is whether we have an innate desire for God or just an innate desire for all these attributes like beauty and justice, which God happens to have. In the second case, God would be an unnecessary hypothesis. Let me rephrase the question. Richard, when you die, either you're going to find out that there is a God and there is a heaven and there is a mystical experience that you can enter into, or that there is not. Wouldn't you rather embrace the first and the second? Wouldn't you at least hope that all this fairy tale stuff is in fact true and you can have it? And if so, isn't that an innate desire for not just these attributes, but something that perfects all of them?
Well, that's an interesting new twist to the argument. I think to answer it, I'd need a further specification of what was on offer. I mean, clearly anybody who loves life wants it to continue. Anybody who loves life wants the things that make life worth living to continue. whether that means one wants them to continue to all eternity is a rather different question, I think. And various people, as I'm sure you know, that the British philosopher Bernard Williams wrote a very influential paper about what he called the tedium of immortality. That we make sense of our lives because they are finite, because they have a kind of finite shape, that we move from birth through youth, middle age, old age, and with different stages of life bring different kinds of meaning with them. The notion of having one's life extend ad infinitum really, I think, leaves one quite, not knowing what.
Oh, I quite agree.
Yeah,
I
okay.
Agree.
So, sorry, I mean that's going
eternity.
off in a whole new direction. But I'm responding to your question, and
you are.
I'm really, I'm really not at all sure that I would give the answer that you were looking for there.
Well, I don't think we do have a desire for infinite temporal prolongation of anything in our experience, because that would get boring.
Right.
But I think we do have a desire for some mystical transcendence of time, which we in fact experience in this life. For instance, when you suddenly fall in love and are loved in return, time is meaningless. You seem to be participating in a mystical experience which is incapable of boredom until you re-enter time. So let's take that as our prime desire, the desire to love and be loved. Sartre, in No Exit, argues very brilliantly that is a desire which cannot possibly be attained, because if somebody knows you and knows what kind of a miserable person you are, they can't possibly love you. So to be known and to be loved perfectly at the same time is impossible. Yet everyone who has an out-of-body experience or a near-death experience and meets a so-called being of light comes back with the report that this being of light loves them totally and knows them totally at the same time. No matter what their original religious beliefs may be, they seem to share that experience, which is either an experience of something that is objectively real, or at the very least is an experience of what their hearts most deeply desire. Well, that total personal knowledge and personal love at the same time necessarily is not infinite temporally, but infinite in terms of perfection. If you met God and God says, well, I love 99% of you, but this part of you, which is a necessary part of you and can never change, this part I can never accept and never love. Or if God said, I love you, but only by blinking one eye, because I don't know you totally. It's a fiction, but I'll love this fiction, which is not you. That would not satisfy you. So what we want and search for in our earthly relationships among other human beings and find the greatest joy in partially attaining is this experience of being both known and loved simultaneously and perfectly. So that's not something like beauty that we're satisfied with finite amounts of. That's something that we demand totality in.
As the Apostle Paul put it, one day he will be fully known as he knows things partially now.
And now it's just through a glass darkly.
Indeed, yes.
Like
Well, you're a Baptist.
through the bottom of a pint glass. Yes. All right. Well, thank you, Peter. I mean, that takes it in an interesting direction again. And I mean, I think it raises the question of what we mean by this word transcendent and transcendence, which we've been alluding to every now and then, and which you brought to the forefront a bit now. And okay, yes, I recognise those kinds of experience that you talked about, which you described as a mystical transcendence of time. I'm not sure about mystical, but certainly I recognise what you say about experiences which, for the moment, seem to lift one outside of time, outside of one's day-to-day existence, like the experience of falling in love or loving and being loved, like the experience of seeing a wonderful sunset or hearing an incredibly moving and uplifting piece of music, something like that. Now, again, there's a kind of ambiguity here, I think, because, and it really is an interesting ambiguity as to what we mean by transcendence here, because in a worldly, what I might call a humanist sense, I can recognise those kinds of experiences as being in themselves transcendent. They lift you out of your day-to-day life, and they're They're what make life worth living, if you like. But again, why isn't that enough? I mean, clearly, desires for those sorts of experiences have a real object, because we've just been, it's the real object we've just been talking about. People do experience desires for this kind of thing and experience the satisfaction of those desires. What I'm still not clear about is why you then see these as pointers to, or a desire for, something which is transcendent in some much stronger sense.
Can we put a bit of sort of meat on this? So, for instance, give us a for instance here, Richard. Are there pieces of music which you would say, in some sense, give you an almost transcendent feeling?
Okay, well, in preparation for this programme, I was listening last night to Richard Strauss's Four Last Songs. Wonderful pieces, and I guess they partly because they express, in a way, the kind of longing and yearning which we're talking about here. But I don't think they point to anything in some transcendent realm. What they point to is a certain kind of experience.
Are you prepared, though, to really... Does it boil down to the chemicals that they release when they hit the nerve endings in your ear, which produce the sort of...
No, it doesn't. And that would be a crass kind of reductive materialism. No, I mean, clearly they involve chemicals in the brain at some level, but the idea that you can say all that you need to say about such an experience in terms of neurophysiology or biochemistry would just be nonsense. I mean, they are fundamental human experiences of an incredibly valuable kind. I mean, that's just one example, but from human relationships, from the arts, from our various other strivings and creative endeavours and so on. So yes, there are these incredibly valuable kinds of experience which lift one out of one's day-to-day life. But
Richard, would you
Okay.
you say that these experiences don't prove God, and I agree, but don't they at least point that way? Isn't it like a pointing finger in Plato's cave? Look, there is the entrance.
Well, this is what's wrong with Plato, really. I mean, this is where I'd rather go with Aristotle. But we won't get into that. I mean, why do they need to point to something more than themselves? I guess that's my core question. Why aren't they enough?
Well, they don't need to,
No,
but they do.
Okay, why do you... well, I guess that's where we reach the fundamental disagreement, because I don't think that they do point to anything beyond themselves. They are there. They are an incredibly valuable part of human life, and we recognise what they are, and that's where I guess I'd stop, and where you would want to go further.
Why then do you think that so many people interpret them as pointing beyond themselves? You admit that the religious urge is almost universal, and this is presumably one of the experiences that point in that direction. So why do unsophisticated, non-philosophical people almost universally follow the pointing finger and say there is an exit from the cave?
Not, I think, because they're following that particular pointing finger. I mean, again, we'd be going in a different direction here as to how you explain that almost universal belief in some kind of deity. And I'd give priority in the explanation to a lot of very, very different things, actually. I mean, first of all, the desire for some kind of explanation of the natural world, a divine creator and so on, and we know about the kinds of issues that raises about arguments from design and that kind of thing. But historically, the more difficulty human beings have had in explaining natural phenomena, the more they have been inclined to believe in some kind of deity. And although, of course, there are complex questions about relationship between religious explanations and scientific explanations, still, that I'd give much more emphasis to that as part of the explanation of why people are inclined to believe in a deity. Also, I guess... desires for not exactly the kinds of desires we've been talking about, but desires for things like absolute safety and absolute comfort, and a kind of friendship that will never let you down, and so on. And of course, one can understand
the thing
why.
that even Wittgenstein believed in. He called it the mystical.
Okay, yes, that as well. Although that's a bit different again. I mean, what I was referring to is rather more mundane desires that grow out of people's sense. Well, not mundane.
Well, absolute
but,
safety is not a mundane thing.
I take back the word mundane. Right, but desires that one can explain in terms of people's experience of their own fragility and vulnerability, and again, that goes a long way to explaining why people tend to believe in a deity. Now, if you've got those in place, then indeed, I guess I can see why also people's experiences of the kind we've been talking about, moments that lift you out of time, as it were, or experienced as lifting you out of time, how they would then feed into that conception of a deity. But I don't think that they're enough by themselves to explain why people hold such beliefs.
Well, most people are not philosophers, first of all, and therefore their first demand is not an adequate logical explanation. I think hope is deeper in most people's psyches than intellect. So I think we'd agree that whether the religious urge is true or false, its psychological origin is more in terms of hope and desire than in terms of explanation.
Yeah,
right?
I'd agree with that, yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, then we get into something like Pascal's wager. Don't you at least hope that this fairy tale is true? And if you do, then you're not an atheist but an agnostic. You leave the door a little bit open, even though you don't think there's anybody on the other side.
Okay, yeah. Well, I think if I'm talking about my own experience, the answer is no. I mean, I can see it would be nice to have a friend that never lets you down, to have a comforter who will always be there for you. But I also know that life is not like that, and actually, what makes life interesting and exciting is that one's hopes and wishes are not always satisfied, and that life involves struggles to overcome difficulties, life involves challenges, and the idea that there could be some kind of ultimate comfort, which is a total fulfillment of all one's desires, is, I think, a hope that one leaves behind.
Yeah, I mean, you've already called it wish fulfillment,
yes.
Essentially, is what you think this
Yes.
argument boils down to. Now, I'd just be interested to hear from you, Peter, why you don't think this argument is just wish fulfillment. I mean, people can long for something without it necessarily being true, can't they? I can wish that I had a new Mercedes, but it won't turn up necessarily in my drive just on the basis of me wishing. Now, why is that different in terms of wish fulfillment than what you're talking about?
Because of the distinction between natural and artificial wishes. There's no artificial wish, no wish that comes from human artifice that assures us that its object exists. But there's no other natural wish, except maybe the wish for God, that doesn't correspond to something that really exists. So we're back to the original argument.
In the previous bit of our conversation, where we were talking about things like a desire for a friendship that will never, a friend who will never let you down, a comforter who will always be there for you. It seems to me that you can call these natural desires, if you like. We can quite adequately explain why we have such desires without having to suppose or hypothesize that there really is a friend who will never let you down, a comforter who will always be there for you. Our adequate explanation of our having those desires,
well, that begs the question.
It's just is based in everything that we know about human experience as to why people should want these things.
But I would argue that our desire for a friend who will never let us down, etc., is part of the package deal of the original argument, and that the human explanation for this desire is not adequate. If in our experience all friends do let you down,
yes.
Why do we desire something that we know we will never get in this life, namely a friend who will never let you down?
We need to distinguish between wishes and desires here. Don't you? And this is why I was saying, one can wish for a friend who will never let you down, but once you grow up and realise that that's not, that there is no such being, as I would say, then the desire becomes simply a wish of a, less perhaps even than a wish. It would, you get to the point of saying, well, it would be nice if, but that's not that's not what life is really like.
Yeah, that's a good distinction. No, I'd have to say it's a desire, not just a wish. When somebody that you deeply love is dying, and the doctor says there is no hope for his cure, this disease has never had a cure, and you say to the doctor, "Well, that may be so, but I still hope that he survives."
Hope against hope, as it were.
That's not a wish. That's a demand.
That's something else again.
That's a demand that the universe, it seems, does not grant.
But to come back to the other claim, then, looking for an adequate explanation of that desire or demand or hope. The adequate explanation of that is very readily found, isn't it? In purely naturalistic terms. Why you should, when the doctor says there is no hope, you still desperately want there to be hope.
Well, that's why I said at the beginning that this is an argument but not a proof.
Okay.
You don't have to follow the pointing finger. You can have a logically consistent explanation without a God. It's just not as good. It's not as satisfying.
Why isn't it as satisfying? So let's get you from you at this point, Peter. Why, for you, God is the best explanation of these desires, whereas obviously Richard feels he can see, have access to those same desires, but doesn't have to follow the pointing finger in the same direction. He points it in the other direction towards a naturalistic universe in which these desires can be adequately explained by presumably our evolutionary history, the way that we function, in the way that these desires mold us into people who are then fit for reproduction and so on.
If I said that it couldn't be explained that way, I'd have to say that all atheists are idiots. And if he said that it can't be explained that way, you have to say that all theists are idiots. And Freud almost came to that position. He regarded religion as literally an insanity, a kind of a collective hallucination. But that involves you in a kind of intolerable snobbery. So we have here two explanations, each of which has a plausibility to it. So which do you choose? Well, you can choose on two different bases, and here I'm going back to William James's classic little essay, The Will to Believe. You can use Clifford's rule, which says never believe anything unless you have adequate evidence for it. Or you can say, as James does, that may be a very good principle in scientific method, but it's a very bad principle in ordering human life. A friend says it's raining outside, and you say, well, I don't have adequate evidence for that, so I'm not going to prove it. Why not trust? Why not hope? Since you gain so much by doing so, even in this life, much less in the next, there's at least an intellectual respectability.
It is that interesting. I mean, it does come back a little bit to the the Pascal's wager sort of issue. I'm tempted to ask you, Richard, whether you would like, at any level, going back to a question that Peter asked you, whether you would like to be wrong when it came down to it, and to be shown that there is an ultimate good and ultimate...
Can we come back to that in a moment? Because there's a previous point that I don't want to lose. The point about, how you decide what is the best explanation, because the way I'd want to go on that is neither the Clifford way nor the James way. It's neither a matter of just piling up the evidence until it's incontrovertible, or taking a wager. I mean, I guess the reason why, going back to the examples we were looking at, why I'd want to say God is not the best explanation and the naturalistic explanation is the better explanation, is that the theistic explanation has to bring with it a whole lot of metaphysics, a whole ontological framework, which I just don't find plausible. The naturalistic explanation is the better explanation because it comes with so much less baggage. It doesn't require us to posit a whole non-physical universe, a non-physical being who is in some sense a person but not a physically embodied person. It's that whole metaphysical framework that goes with the explanation in terms of a God, which seems to me to make that a much more much less accessible explanation and a much less plausible explanation than the naturalistic one.
And we need a whole other hour to get into that.
We do indeed, and I would love to have it. Yes. Justin, do you want me to come back to your question?
Well, let's do that. I mean, as you, both of you are making clear, and I'm enjoying so much this discussion between two people who obviously very bright thinkers, but both of you in the end obviously come to this argument with a different set of presuppositions about the world, and presumably that will inform the amount of weight you're going to give to a given argument. And so presumably for your perspective, Peter, having thought through the issues around the metaphysical aspects of God, you're satisfied that actually that too is best explained within the framework of the universe as we find it.
Yes, most non-philosophers are metaphysicians.
We haven't got much time before the end of this part of the program, so but just quickly, be interested before we get Peter come back in on this. Going back to that original question Peter asked you, is there any part of you, Richard, that would actually like to be proven wrong in the end, and that there is an ultimate purpose, ultimate meaning, an ultimate being, for want of a better word, that you will that is responsible for this whole show?
Not being proved wrong in that way. I mean, I always love being proved wrong because I'm a philosopher and I love an argument. But no, I don't think I'm actually. Perhaps this is another difference between us. But temperamentally, I'm not attracted to being proved wrong in the sense of being shown that actually there is some kind of that there is some kind of purpose built into the universe, which is already laid down for us. I really don't much like the idea of living in a world where our purposes are already decided for us. I'd rather. Why?
Wouldn't you rather be in a Shakespearean play than in an ad hoc ad lib drama that you have to make up the silly lines yourself?
I wouldn't like to live my whole life in a Shakespearean play. No, I don't mind spending a couple of hours acting it, but the idea that it should be my whole life would be a nightmare. If I could never ad lib, that would be terrible.
So the life is full of sound and fury signifying nothing.
Only in one line.
I mean, but it's interesting to me though, because this suggests then that you obviously for you there is no actual desire for God in that sense. Whatever.
I think yes. In the end, that's what I'd want to say.
Is that now? Is that? Because
desire for all sorts of things of kinds that we've been talking about, which are a lot more than just the desire for, mundane satisfactions, like enough food and drink in one's belly and so on. So all kinds of desires, which, if you like, you could call desires for the transcendent, depending on how you unpack that. But no, I guess in the end, I have to say no.
For me, I find that interesting because part of the way I suppose I think of God is that God is a being that in the end will show that will in some way make just every injustice, that will kind of give an answer to every wrong that has ever been. And for me, as much as I can't prove that to you, the idea of that is at one level very comforting, but at another level helps me to make sense of this universe and think that it's not just meaningless, that there is a sort of an ultimate sort of point to all of the suffering.
A lot of big questions there about what it would be for the universe to be not just meaningless. Clearly, I don't think that it's a universe that's just meaningless. If you take the example of a struggle for justice, of course, the struggle for justice carries with it a recognition that it would be wonderful if this world were a great deal more just than it actually is. But I guess also, and again this may just be a temperamental difference here, I guess also I want to say that the struggle for a more just world is partly the appeal of justice, but partly also the appeal of the struggle. That the desire for justice is, for me, bound up with the challenge of trying to bring it about, the challenge of working with other people to try to change things, working, by the way, with secular and Christian people in ways that I think is terribly important. Yeah. But it's the struggle for justice as much as
ever were. If the world ever were perfectly just, the thrill of the chase would be gone and it would be boring.
Yes, that makes it sound a bit too self-indulgent, doesn't it? But if justice was something that could be brought about just by the waving of a magic wand, I'd feel cheated, I think.
So it is better to travel hopefully than to arrive?
Okay,
You know what
yes,
C.S. Lewis
yes,
said to
yeah,
that? If that were true, how could one ever travel hopefully? There would be no hope in arriving.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Well, you can travel hopefully from the experience that you're getting there. In the case of justice, that's true, even if, with the analogy of literal travel, it doesn't sound very convincing.
We're going to have to take a quick break, gentlemen. We'll conclude our thoughts in a moment's time. We've been talking about the argument from desire on today's show. Does our desire for God show that he does exist? We're asking today. Peter Kreeft is our Christian guest, Richard Norman, our atheist guest, and we'll be back in just a short moment's time. Hello and welcome back to Unbelievable with me, Justin Brierley, the third and final part of today's programme. This is the show that brings Christians and non-Christians together to discuss and debate, and we'll be hearing the final part of the discussion between my guests today, Peter Kreeft and Richard Norman, on the argument from desire. We'll also be hearing some of your feedback towards the end of today's programme as we reflect on some of the past shows, including issues around the probability of the resurrection, miracles, and indeed last week's show with Greg Kokel of Stand to Reason, as he took various objections to the Bible and God from a number of listeners. We'll be hearing how some atheist and Christian listeners to this show responded to that. Coming up next week, if you can come back same time, same place, you'll hear a special radio feature I'm putting together. It's an interview with 3 same-sex attracted church leaders, followed by a discussion with representatives on both sides of the debate. I interviewed these church leaders for Christianity magazine, and they told me about how they've come to reconcile their sexuality with their belief that the Bible prohibits same-sex relationships. 2 of them have remained celibate, and they talk about some of the issues surrounding that as far as being a church leader is concerned. The other has experienced a measure of change in his feelings, such that he's actually become married to a woman and has kids. Well, you'll be hearing their stories next week on the show, and we'll be hearing how some guests joining me respond to it as we have a discussion on the back of that. If you do want to check out the feature I wrote interviewing these 3 guys, then do check out the August edition of Christianity magazine. You can also find the article online at christianitymagazine.co.uk. For now, let's get back into the final part of today's debate.
You're listening to Unbelievable on Premier Christian Radio.
Well, as we finish today's conversation on whether our desire for God shows that he exists, we've been hearing in the course of today's show from Peter Kreeft, who's a professor of philosophy at Boston College in the United States, well known as a Christian thinker and writer, publisher of many books. The Handbook of Christian Apologetics and Christianity for Modern Pagans are just a couple of the titles. PeterKreeft.com if you want to find out more. Kreeft spelt KREEFT.com. I believe you said it's Dutch for lobster, Peter, is that correct?
Right, I'm edible.
Jolly good. Richard Norman, our other guest, has been putting the other side of the argument to Peter. He's Emeritus Professor of Moral Philosophy at the University of Kent, one of the Vice Presidents of the British Humanist Association, and I'll put some links to where you can find more about him as well, of course, with today's programme, which you can find at premier.org.uk/unbelievable. Before we come back to Richard, Peter, you were having a great interaction there with Richard on this subject of whether people do usually want there to be an ultimate meaning, ultimate justice, all of those big concepts. And Richard saying, actually, well, I feel like the struggle to achieve those things is what's important, and might even feel a bit cheated if it turned out it was all, pre-arranged, done and dusted in advance. What's your response to that generally? Is that a fair characterization of the God that you're thinking of in this argument?
No, it has a lot to do with time. One of the things we desire is to transcend time. All our most precious moments are moments where we're lifted out of one kind of time and into another kind of time. In fact, most languages have 2 words for time. English has only one. Kairos versus chronos in Greek. So I suspect that the nub of the difference between us is our ability or inability to conceive this state of perfection, which would be union with God or heaven or nirvana, in a way that wouldn't get boring. And I agree that we find a great difficulty in imagining that. and yet we desire this something which we can barely imagine. So we come back to the original argument. Let me just conclude with a story. I'm not sure who this is from. It's an atheist philosopher, I think it's Sidney Hook, who wrote an autobiography, and there's a chapter entitled The Day I Met Martin Buber. Buber is the great Jewish thinker, the rabbi, who defended theism. And the philosopher visited Buber and said, "You are the only man in the world that believes in God that I respect, and I do not believe in God. So please give me a reason for believing in God. Please prove the existence of God to me." And Buber said, "I do not have a piece of paper in my back pocket on which is written an infallible proof of the existence of God. I cannot do it." "Is that your only answer?" said the atheist. "Yes," said Buber. The atheist angrily stormed out of the room, but just before he closed the door, Buber added one sentence, "But can you be sure there is no God?" And then the last sentence of the chapter is, "I am still an atheist, but Buber's question has haunted me for the rest of my life." So I hope that Richard is at least occasionally haunted by that question.
Richard, you've described this argument for you as equivalent to wish fulfillment, but is it wrong in a sense for people's hopes and desires for them to believe that those are met in some kind of ultimate being?
Depends what you mean by wrong. I mean, I do think in the end, it's wrong to base one's beliefs. Yeah, it's wrong to base one's beliefs on one's hopes and desires. Now, and in saying that, I'm not wanting to as it were, pour scorn on people who hold religious beliefs and for whom those beliefs are very much tied up with, their deepest wishes and their deepest desires. But clearly, from the way in which you put it, if our beliefs generally, were based on what we would like to be the case, we would be in a real mess. And I mean, you only have to look at the whole of human history to see why that's the case. I mean, just to take the example that comes to mind, people, the invasion of Iraq happened because people wanted to believe that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. If they'd looked at the evidence instead of just going by what they wanted to find, we'd be in a lot better shape now. I mean, that's just one dramatic example. But I mean, it's obviously the case that if we based our beliefs about what is the case and what we would like to be the case, we would be in shtuck. But that's not to say, that I in any way want to diminish or dismiss the deep hopes that people invest in religious belief. I don't share those beliefs, but I do see the need to try, as we said at the beginning, see the need to try to understand them and to try to do justice to them. But when it comes to hopes, and my own hopes and desires, I think from what we've just been saying, you can see that those lead in a different direction. And let me just try to link that back to what Peter was saying about how the way in which our deepest experiences involve a sense of transcending time. And these are the sorts of experiences that we talked about earlier. And as experiences, clearly they're incredibly valuable and important to people, and we may describe them as experiences which seem to transcend time. But that's a description of the experience. It's not literally the case that they are moments out of time. It's as though time was suspended when you hear a beautiful melody or see a beautiful sunset or fall in love. But time isn't actually suspended. That's the language that we search for to try to describe that experience, but it's a description of the experience. It's not a description of some metaphysical realm.
And it wouldn't add anything if that experience did have some, as it were, something beyond itself that it was actually a reflection of.
I don't think it would. No, on the contrary, I think that the value of those experiences is that they are located within our ongoing lives. The magic of those moments has a lot to do with the fact that most of our lives are not like that, but they need the regular tenor of those lives in order in order for us to see the magic in those moments.
But the magic is a happy accident rather than
not a happy accident. No, that's a bit too dismissive again. But the magic comes from the contrast between those elevating moments and the more humdrum existence that they're contrasted with.
Thank you very much for being on the programme today. Very interesting to have your contributions. Peter, any final thoughts as we wrap up yourself?
I think what Richard says about music is quite reasonable, but does not apply to religious experiences. If I found that there was no metaphysical component to my enjoyment of music, that would not threaten me. But if I found that all my faith and hope and love of God did not correspond to any existing being, and they were merely experiences, I think that would vitiate them. So there may not have to be an ultimate music, but there has to be an ultimate God.
Oh, that's been the subject of our discussion today, and well, we were never going to settle it to the satisfaction of both sides on the programme today, but we don't expect to do that ever really on this show. But it does certainly, I certainly hope it's got you thinking. Thank you, gentlemen, both, for being with me today.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
It's been great fun. Really, really fun, actually, to have two really sharp thinkers with me on the programme today. Peter Kreeft is out in the States. He's a Christian thinker and writer. You want more from him? Well, why not visit his website, peterkreeft.com, spelt KREEFT.com. Richard Norman, you can find more about him if you search for him on Google. You'll find links to his books and things he's written for the British Humanist Association and others. I'll certainly provide some links with the podcast of today's programme as well for both my guests today. You want to find out more?